EST for me over here. We're going to go ahead and get started here. I know we have about an hour together. I want to maximize our time and just want to welcome everyone here. The webinar format is a little bit different in terms of kind of the way we can communicate back and forth, but just want to see who's here with us so far. If you want to just introduce yourself in the chat box, just any information that you feel you want to share, maybe something about where you might be, where you might be located. But good to hear from a couple of you here. And again, welcome. I am, if you haven't met me already, I am Dr. Elijah Lee. I'm the program director here at the Clinical Mental Health Counseling Department at Huntington University. And I am with Dr. Koch, who is the Clinical Experience Director. I don't know if that's enough of an introduction, Dr. Koch. Yeah, okay. So it's enough of an introduction for now. Really, our time together, this is one of hopefully many times that we can gather together as a community. And really what this was birthed out of that desire to have a community together, not only for the student body, but those who are connected to Huntington University and counseling profession as well. But really to have a gathering place where, again, this is a webinar format. It's together in virtual space, but together nonetheless. And so really this time of gathering the counseling community connection for us here at Huntington University, we really wanted to have a gathering place and a community place of like-minded folks. So really, I mean, what we have today, what we had prepared today really was to introduce some of the faculty members here, Dr. Koch and myself right here. Unfortunately, Dr. Williams cannot be with us today, and the goal and what we wanted to really present you with was with us. And so you'll get two of us today, but really our time together here is to talk a little bit about our calling as professionals, as counselors, some of you who are being trained to be counselors as well, and fulfilling that call to be a counselor during this unique time that we're in. And some of what we'll share is our personal journeys as counselor educators and as counselors throughout this time, and hopefully some snippets here that'll help you in your journey as well. And looking at times in the future, we really do want to have an interaction with you as well. So in the future, we are working towards having maybe a time outside of the webinar format where we can just converse during Zoom. But for our time here, if you have questions, please submit those in the chat box. And we have Nathan here helping us as well. And you can submit questions there. We're at the end. We'll take some questions and to answer those as well. So let's get started here. I mean, really, when I envision our time together, again, it's this context of seeing us online, and I don't know where you are currently. You might be in your living rooms, you might be in your office. I think some of the kind of work at home environments have created a context where we're working from home. But what I see kind of in my mind's eye is really all of us together around the living room. It's winter time right now, and so maybe we're at the fireplace and we're talking together. And you know, it's kind of like the maybe not as monumental as the fireside chats of old, but that's kind of what I imagine. You know, maybe the radio on, and there's kind of the sense of what is going on in the world, and how do we perceive it. And both Dr. Koch and myself are counselor educators. We are individuals that have kind of made it our goal to have an idea about what's going on in the world of counseling. And sometimes that's kind of audacious in my mind to kind of say, well, we're experts in the field. And I think with this pandemic, we've really found out that that's been turned upside down. So I wanted to share a verse with you just to start with. And this is the verse that really has started to kind of percolate in my mind and my spirit. And this is Hebrews 12, 26 to 28. When God spoke from Mount Sinai, his voice shook the earth. But now he makes another promise. Once again, I will shake not only the earth, but the heavens also. This means that all of creation will be shaken and removed so that only unshakable things will remain. Since we are receiving a kingdom that is unshakable, let us be thankful and please God by worshiping him with holy fear and awe, for our God is a devouring fire. This verse has kind of resonated into my spirit as I have contemplated some of what has gone on during this time. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but let's pray together and invite God into our time and ask him to be a part of our time together. Father, we give you the seat of honor here, and we invite you to our conversation around what's going on in the counseling world, around what may be coming up even in our hearts as we start to look around and see all of what has transpired in the past couple of years. So we do ask you to come and sit at our table, sit in the living room with us, and as a father, that you'd come and shepherd our hearts, that you'd add revelation, that you'd add understanding, that you'd add your own spirit, your presence to the things that we talk about, that we might have a little bit of an idea about, but you can always give us more. So I'm asking for us as a group that you give us that, you give us more, and that you join us today. In the name of Jesus we pray, amen. So this idea of an unshakable kingdom, in the light of what has happened in the past couple of years, I think that on some ends, really that's comforting, but again, on some ends, it may feel elusive. And I was just thinking this morning, and this has been a dynamic that has been occurring quite a bit in whether I'm teaching or whether I'm speaking, that at the last moment, there's something that happens that changes the landscape of what I know. And this morning, it was contemplating on our new Delta variant Omicron. And so I was looking over my notes and I was reading them through, and I noticed that all of the things that I've written were in the past tense, moving through the pandemic, that we're moving through some things that have happened in the past. And that is true. I think we are. At the same time, we are moving through. We are currently all together experiencing something corporately that for many of us has been unprecedented. And so in that vein, in that way, right now, as I'm speaking to you, we have a corporate experience. We're experiencing something all together. And in that, I think there can be a sense of undoing loneliness, right? And part of what I'll mention in the latter half of my talk is this idea of the illness of disconnection. And I think in the pandemic, what has emerged is this illness of disconnection, which in some regards right now we're trying to remedy through these means. If you've been with us in the student body, you know that Dr. Koch and myself, we're new here to Huntington, creating a program that is mainly online. Of course, we have a residential component with the intensives, but mainly we are interacting with you online, which is the purpose of this talk, which is the purpose of this community meeting, which again, this isn't the only time we can converse with each other, but it's a place where we can all gather together and have a common purpose or common vision. So some of what I wanted to share with you is just to get an inside scoop in some regards to what's been happening in our department. Conversely, I mean, at the same time, it's what's happening with maybe you as well, in terms of how you're connected with us, whether you're a student, whether you're part of the faculty, or any of those different places that you could be connected. But as a faculty, we've been gathering together, and many of us actually, we've just transpired through the last iteration of doctoral training that really we should have the cutting edge knowledge, right? That we're coming out of the past few years of what we're learning about the counseling profession and coming into the counseling department here at Huntington. Now, as that's transpired in the past couple of years, I never imagined in my doctoral work, I didn't imagine that a pandemic would ensue right at the end of it. You know, happy graduation. Here's a space where everything has been turned upside down, and now everything that we have learned now needs to be adapted and renewed and applied, right? And that's where we're at. We're taking what we know, adapting it, and then applying it to the context that we are. So this conversation on some regard is an attempt to kind of just say, you know, we're figuring it out and we're figuring out it together. So it's an invitation to journey with us through this process of discovering what it means to really be a counselor in the time of COVID and beyond. So that's really kind of introduction. It's a introductory conversation, right? We're going to be having this conversation in classes. We're going to be having it in department meetings. We're going to be having it in all kinds of different places because this isn't going away, right? The impact of what has happened isn't going away. Just to start with here, I wanted to start with what we have been really meditating on as a faculty. And Dr. Cook, if you want to bring that presentation up, we'll start with the counseling department vision statement. And again, this is departmental for us. This is kind of an inside scoop, an inside kind of view of what we have been meditating on. Soon we'll be introducing our mission statement, which includes you as students and potentially you as faculty as well, and others, and we'll expand on that in a little bit. But this first Jeremiah 3:15, that God would raise up shepherds after his own heart in the field of counseling that will lead and guide his people with knowledge and understanding. This verse has become more and more meaningful, I think, to myself. And as we've been talking as a faculty together, we've been mining out what this really means. And in my education and in my doctoral program at Regent University, there was a time when we were all gathering together to say our goodbyes. It was a residency similar to what we have at Huntington University. And all of us students were gathered together for our last residency, and we were giving exhortations and encouragements. And one of the things that I mentioned to our group there was that as I was a part of a community, as I started the journey together with other like-minded folks, as I started to have a common purpose and a common vision with people that were traveling along the same road, that there's something that was imparted to me, that there's something that I gathered, that I gained by being with them. And I'll give you a story from the Bible that's similar to what I feel like was an experience of that impartation of grace to really fulfill the call of God on my life. And one of those places was when Saul was traveling and he saw a company of prophets. And when he saw the company of prophets, it speaks about this place where he joined in with the company of prophets and he started prophesying with them. There was a gift that was actually imparted by him being with the company of prophets and by joining in with others. And when I said, you know, I shared this verse about that particular place with Saul and the company of prophets, I said to this group of individuals, I said, by me traveling with you on this road, that I believe that I have joined with you and I have found the company of shepherds. And by joining with you, I believe that I become a shepherd with you. And this idea of shepherding is a place where, again, there's a lot of different places in the scriptures that talk about God as a shepherd, as Jesus as a shepherd, and also talks about this idea of the scattering of the sheep, right? People without a shepherd. And so there's this place that we need shepherds to guide, specifically in the field of counseling, but this idea of guiding people with knowledge and understanding, I think, is very apt. For myself as a counselor educator, and for you as counselors and those who are budding to be counselors, there's a place where you'll lead and guide people with the knowledge and understanding that you have. And so this has become central in the place of a kind of conversation with our group And one of the things that you may have read in the newsletter we sent out is a verse in Proverbs 29:18 that says, where there is no vision, the people are unrestrained. And what this really means to me is that without a vision, we really don't have a place where we're going to be really disciplined to walk that out. It's this place of unrestrained, right? We can do whatever we want because we don't really know exactly what the road is to walk on. So as we're talking about what's happened in the past couple of years, we are focusing in on this area of counseling, in the field of counseling. And again, kind of this place where we want to focus not only in the field of counseling, but focus in on the person who is helping us to grow in this place, which is Jesus the shepherd, and also focusing on a place where we can be standing on an unshakable kingdom. So again, kind of looking into our conversations in our counseling department and looking in, the two places for me that have really emerged are this place of calling and community. And you'll see it here, calling and community. And one of the pieces of literature, Dick and Duffy, and they talk about a transcendent summons. They say a calling is a transcendent summons originating beyond the self. And I want to link this back to what I shared about Saul. And Saul was in a place where he was given grace with a certain gifting. And as I have been contemplating the past 2 years, for me, what has emerged is more of a sense that we need the grace of God in order to sustain our field and really to move forward as a profession. And honestly, there was some struggle in really even coming up with the first webinar, as there's so much literature. There's so much literature, and even with COVID, we have a whole database in Huntington University that talks about COVID and the emerging literature and different things. And I could have easily come up with, at least, 7 or 8 different sources that are talking about this emergence of some of what the knowledge base is with COVID. And you can do that really easily as you go into the Huntington University database as well. To start with, I just want to really exhort us and simplify it and saying we cannot move forward without the grace of God. Building this house, and it says in the Bible, that the laborers will labor in vain if we're building by ourselves, right? If the Lord does not build a house, the laborers labor in vain. And so, again, the first part of this talk is just to kind of center us and saying, we really do need the grace of God as we're moving forward. But in tandem with that, we are really going to need the skill sets and really the tools in our hands to move forward. So Dr. if you're going to go to the next slide there, we have started talking about our mission statement as a faculty, as a department as well. And I'll just read it to you here. Huntington University counselors to engage diverse cultural contexts through the cultivation of clinical skills, critical thinking, and academic excellence. So these are the nuts and bolts. I first touched upon the Christ-centered counselor training, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Later on, I'll talk about the idea of equipping counselors to engage diverse cultural contexts. The next part of this is going to be Dr. Koch talking about the cultivation of clinical skills, critical thinking, and academic excellence. Before we jump into mission, though, I do think that we do need to start at vision. And really, part of what I shared in this idea of receiving a kingdom that is unshakable, I think that is something that is primary, and that we should first keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, who is the author and the perfecter of our faith, and then move into these places where, again, we're going to give some ideas here in the field of counseling and some ideas that might be present as we're moving forward and scaffolding our knowledge here. But again, I want to start with the simplicity of Christ, just in the beginning. And the simplicity of Christ, and Christ is our builder and the rock that is going to build and to help us to be shepherded through this time. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I want to kind of turn it over to Dr. Koch here, who's going to share a little bit of kind of a framework and a little bit of an elucidation of this idea in our mission statement that says that we want to cultivate clinical skills, critical thinking, and academic excellence.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Lee. I appreciate it, sharing your thoughts. And as you are speaking of Jesus being the author and perfecter of our faith, I was actually going to start out talking a little bit about narrative therapy and how important it is to contemplate our own stories, but also with the reference of Jesus being the author of our stories, the author of our faith, as we continue to contemplate what it means to move forward in the profession amidst some really challenging times. And so I appreciate that. The mind meld between faculty has already started. So I'd love to share a little bit of my story in the context of the idea of the mission statement and where we go from here, essentially. Not necessarily that we have all of the answers, none of us do. It's a continually changing piece, but yet at the same time, I am optimistic about where we are going as a profession, where we are going as a department. And I wouldn't say I hope that that's not blind optimism. I don't think that it is, because I have been in this profession, thankfully, long enough. God called me to it about 10 years ago, that I have seen the mettle, and I have seen the gentleness, I have seen the persistence, I have seen the qualities of counselors within this realm that we're fortunate enough to work with. So a little bit of my story, and again, narrative therapy is about stories. It's also a lot about the use of metaphors, which really makes me happy. And so the question is, you can't go home again, or can you? So right before the pandemic, about 6 months before the pandemic hit here in St. Louis, about March, my husband and I made the decision to move from Tampa, Florida, where we had lived for 15 years, and make the trek back home to St. Louis, Missouri, where we both grew up and our family is here. I always joke affectionately that the Midwest is a vortex that just pulls you back in no matter how far away you move. Now, if you have moved, which I imagine almost all of you have to this point, you know that it can be an incredibly stressful time. And it's also a time of or moving into a new area that you're particularly excited about. So even though people thought we were a little bit crazy, we decided to take the opportunity to move anyway. So as I mentioned, it was about 6 months before the pandemic began. And so we returned to a home that was both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. There were familiar aspects as far as the roads, same names, the high schools were all in the same places, but there were also fundamental changes, new restaurants, new areas of town to explore. But what happened is that it has remained somewhat unfamiliar because of the pandemic, not being able to pursue being a part of a community again, attending church together, exploring new restaurants and new parks and new areas. And so we have held both over the last year and a half or so, the familiarity and the unfamiliarity. And so my thought here is that there's a parallel process going on here in our profession. And there are familiar aspects of what we do, how we sit with clients, our presence, what's going on globally within the profession. But then we are also holding in the other hand this idea of the unfamiliar. So my thought here is, and as you look at this photograph, this is the Sunshine Skyway Bridge, and it essentially connects from the Sarasota area to Tampa Bay. And you can tell that it is a very steep bridge so that sailboats can move under it. It's a really scary bridge, I'm not going to lie. But what it does is effectively takes you from one place to another. And I would say that there are bridges that are being built in our profession. And these are the actions, these are the ways of thinking that are going to take us from the current state of counseling into the future state. So if I can ground us for just a moment between what's the familiar and what may be still unfamiliar, but becoming so. And how do we build this bridge between those two so that we can effectively work within our profession? That would be wonderful to share this with you. So this is really part of the academic excellence side of our mission statement. And what I mean by that is we know that we're grounded in two spaces. As counselors, we are grounded within the everlasting Word of God. And then we are also grounded in our research. So where opinion meets, right, we have the grounding of the Word, and then we also have our academic research. So I just wanted to share with you a little bit some of the research that has been coming out to help us move from the familiar through the unfamiliar to the bridge. So what has been familiar with us throughout this whole process of the pandemic, ever since Carl Rogers and even further back, has been our real embedded focus on client care and client choice, client agency to come to counseling, to co-create goals, for example. What has been unfamiliar in that space is the idea of telehealth, right? We've probably all experienced telehealth. Upwards of one survey noted that 89% of mental health professionals were using telehealth in 2020, and many are continuing to use it into 2021. But what that did is it really forced a mandatory change. I had to shift all of my clients in less than 1 week from seeing entirely in person to entirely telehealth. And I know some of you have some similar stories. So we had this mandatory and very quick change to new technology. But what that did is that the opportunity there is that it brought greater client reach and choice, which is an aspect that we have always valued. And so there's some benefits there. There's some opportunities there. And the opportunities that continue to present themselves are really found in the topmost part of the bridge. And I don't know about you, but it feels a little bit more present, these opportunities. It feels a little bit more pressing, that we don't necessarily have the time that we used to figure some of these things out as a profession. And what comes to mind, a few of those things are continuing to advocate for client access for mental health care. That's one of the big ones. And we've seen our reach expand in that we can reach more clients that maybe are in more rural areas, as long as they have decent internet access. I know we've probably all been part of the frustration of a telehealth service session where the client keeps cutting in and out and you're thinking, oh, if I could just really be present with you, but there's some barriers in place. So encouraging access there, and certainly the piece of that is insurance reimbursement for telehealth. These orders that have come down from state boards from insurance companies, they have a feeling of temporary to them, right? So the hope is through advocacy, which we are encouraging our Huntington students to get involved in their local counseling organizations to really advocate for these pieces that enable us to do the work that we do for all of our clients. And that includes cross-state licensure. So the hope is ACA and a few other organizations are really championing the idea of cross-state licensure. And they are hoping that about 10 to 15 different states can honor one another's licensure by about 2023, not too far into the future. And then, of course, there's the component, which Indiana has and other states are beginning to formalize this around telehealth training, and particularly for our counselors in training, so that you all are prepared from day one, if your agency or organization allows it, to be able to step into comfortably this telehealth space. What we're hearing, interestingly, is that clients are, of course, much less concerned about certain aspects of telehealth than clinicians are. We do need to hold up the standard and help them, be informed about the process. But the tide is really, turning a little bit more towards telehealth, with our clients enjoying that type of access and that being feasible for them. And there's a whole host of benefits and challenges that I won't get into around telehealth right now. But so we are beginning to create the bridge, and we have for many years. It just feels a little bit steeper right now in some good ways. Now, personally, we have worked as counselors in this familiar space of what's called a conservation of resources. What that means essentially in the literature is that when the rubber meets the road, how do we look around and conserve what we have available to us? If it's time, if it's energy, whatever that, if it's financial, whatever that may be, we do that naturally as human beings, but then also as counselors, as so much of what we do goes towards others. And so we know this. We've been in this space before. We've been in this space where we're balancing family needs and work needs and trying to do our best in that. As a profession, we're also really aware of self-care. Do we always do it to the nth degree? We don't. Do we always, as counselor educators, encourage our students to do it? We try our best, and I know that's integrated in many of the classes that students will take at Huntington. And yet at the same time, it's a very natural part of our language, and hopefully part of the actions that we have been taking for a very long time to prevent burnout. Now, the unfamiliar maybe around the pandemic is that there were quite a few boundaries that were blurred, of course, between work and home. And we were sort of forced to adapt. And so, my practice has been to shut my home office door at the end of the day, to delineate between work and home, and to be careful to leave as much as I can the stories that I have heard during the day, particularly as I specialize in trauma and grief. So we're really seeing some unfamiliarity in the degree to which our work and family roles have flexed and still continue to flex. And this has actually increased the need for the conservation of resources. So we should be maybe getting pretty good at it at this point. So the bridge here to bring us from one side to the other is that we are actually experiencing, a study has shown that counselors specifically have been experiencing higher levels of work-family enrichment, which is essentially, does your work contribute well? Does it enrich your family life? And a recent study came out that said that, yeah, that was the case for a lot of counselors. We also have a greater amount of job security as mental health has become at the forefront. Now, there's also the pressure. I know those of you that are working out in the field probably are getting an overwhelming amount of referrals, people seeking services. And yet, on the other hand, there's this real opportunity for psychoeducation around the importance of mental health as we collectively move forward through this. And then we are experiencing this utilization of these familiar skills that we have all learned in school, even if you've just stepped into the counseling program or if you're partway through it. So these skills are becoming more and more familiar to you about how you self-care, about how you talk to yourself, about how relationships go. And so we are able to use these familiar skills, and I think we need to be reminded about this, that are actually increasing our resources for our family lives. We have these adequate resources and coping skills. And sometimes I think those get a little bit lost during a distressing process. So good reminder there. And so I think to just finish up too is that, again, there are many opportunities here. We also weigh that with the recognition that we are still working through this long tail. And the long tail essentially is this new schema in which we fit our work, we fit our grief and losses, and we fit our clients' grief and losses and traumas that they have been through. And how do we continue to adapt this new schema? And so I'm going to turn it back to Dr. Lee, and he's going to talk just a little bit more about the diverse cultural contexts and some of the pieces that he mentioned before about maybe working through some collective loneliness.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that, Dr. Koch. Yeah, when I hear Dr. Koch talking, I see this kind of place of adaptation that's happening for us. And that's always been us as a human race. We've always adapted. We've always kind of created something that would help us to move forward, right? Something like the wheel that was invented to help us to travel further. And so I think adaptation is the word that I think of in this context, as it helps us to kind of see it as an opportunity of innovation and a place where we can actually take what resources we have and to move forward. What oftentimes happens is that things just kind of pause in the midst of crisis, right? And I think that's really what happened in terms of the pandemic. The world stood still for a moment. I think we all remember the 2 weeks or so that said, after the 2 weeks, we're going to be okay. And now it's about 2 years. And so we need to move forward. And one of the challenges of that is that we have so much going on. One of the parts of our mission statement here is to engage in diverse cultural contexts. And Dr. Koch just talked about the cultivation of clinical skills, critical thinking, academic excellence, all those things that really ground us in the midst of the counseling room. At the same time, diverse cultural context, that's in that phrase, there's really the word diversity, and there's the word context. And by process, by study, by conversation, by really listening to the narratives of others and what's going on with the world, I think that's where we can derive how to apply. So in some ways, we're working a little bit backward from the application to kind of the sense of the broader view, but that's what I want to give in this part of the conversation is the broader view. Now, I used to be an English major. Actually, Dr. Koch used to be, we were both English majors. And I remember in class talking about postmodernity. And one of the phrases that just seems to still linger with me is that fixity is lost in postmodernity. And fixity is just the idea of stability, right? So if you think about post-modernity, it's this idea of really culture moving really quickly. And where fixity is lost is because, well, we got the iPhone 6, next year we got the iPhone 7, next year we got the iPhone 8. Upgrades are happening all the time. So where is the place that we can say there's stability? Post-modernity is a place where constant motion is there. And I think we found and landed in a place which is beyond post-modernity. And so we might need to come up with another phrase. And I think there's some people that are actually talking about some of that beyond post-modernity and what that really looks like. Now, within this idea of kind of change, right? Change not only in the way in which we've conceptualized culture, in the way that we've conceptualized ethnicity, the way in which we have even looked at health and wellness. All of these areas, if you even look at the past 10 years, we're of course looking at counseling. We can't look at the other sectors, but there's been so much change. One of the things that Dr. Koch mentioned, of course, is telehealth. And I've had experiences where, some clients were saying, I will never do telehealth. And now they're doing telehealth. And so that change that can occur in a very short amount of time, that's where we're at. And I think that can drive anyone mad, really. I mean, if you're like myself, I'm an introvert, and so I like to be in quiet spaces and just to kind of be. And just the fact that I am in that quiet place, the world is moving around us. I mean, quite literally, it's moving on its axis, but there's so many things that have happened in the past 10 years. One of the main things that we're focusing on is, of course, the coronavirus pandemic in the past couple of years. So we really need to engage in these diverse cultural contexts. But in one sense, I would say that by our profession being what it is, some things haven't really changed, because as counselors, we have a role to jump into the fire, so to speak, of clients' experiences in crisis. When the first onset of the pandemic occurred, of course, there are a lot of different things that have happened that changes the context on some level. I found myself in that space saying, every week I'm in the midst of crisis with clients, and it seems like on some level, everybody has joined in. And on one end, of course, nobody wants to be in crisis, but the collective experience of crisis is, in some ways, I believe it can draw us together. Excuse me. And so that's part of what I want to talk about, the connectivity that comes from the sense of a common experience. And again, as a community, we have experienced a certain event together. There can really be a connecting point within the human experience, which it's found in that word, experience. It's a commonality within the word experience. Does experiencing joy, sadness, suffering, does that draw us together? I think it does. I think if we allow it to, if we allow our experiences to shape us and to allow our narratives to impact each other, we can sit with and say, wow, this is really happening. And in the space of counseling, what we do is essentially those people that have been stuck, and some of the language of being stuck is in the language of trauma. It's being stuck in a certain place. That to move that forward and move that along, what needs to happen is this idea of resonance, or technically it's limbic resonance. It's the sense of mind to mind, we are connected to another person, and it can move forward the narrative because the other person is experiencing with us in a new way. Just the fact that they are talking with you and talking about it in a different way, hopefully with you as a therapist, if you're a counselor, is that they begin to have a new experience. Now, for us in the midst of crisis, we're not dealing with past trauma, we're dealing with current circumstances. So again, it has to do with a shift in mindset, right, of how we contextualize, of how we move into the experiences of others. And again, some things I don't think have changed in the way that I think about sitting with other human beings. we really need to sit with the human experience, which means we unlearn everything that we've learned and we sit with a new human being, which is a new story, a new book, a new experience. And we just are humbled by the experience and the sacred space that is in front of us. And we sit and we listen and we reflect, right? And so I wonder how that would be if, at the grocery stores where, my wife and I just renewed our Costco membership. And, I thought it was over, but we went to Costco and there's no toilet paper. I thought that was, the first, I don't know if you've experienced in the first onset of the pandemic, the toilet paper for some reason disappeared. And so I went back 3 times, and the third time, I think third time's the charm, I found the toilet paper. So, there's a sense of, I don't know, there's things that I think in our world that have certainly changed. But if people, instead of buying toilet paper, would just sit there at the grocery store and talk to each other. What if we conversed about the experience of, hey, what are you doing? I'm buying toilet paper. What's that like for you? Get out of my way. I want to, it's probably the more experience that we've had. But what if we actually engage with each other in the midst of these moments that, are moving by so fast, because we're essentially where we are in is a very base kind of human mode, which is really our base human mode is as animals, we're in our reptilian brains, right? It's about survival, right? And so to move out of survival into thriving, we really need to have that connectivity, and the connectivity in a relationship, or maybe even love can become something that brings us into a context of moving beyond survival to thriving with each other. So on some level, I think it's that idea of, all we need is love, right? The relationship, that engaging in diverse cultural contexts, or in a technical way, we talk about empathy. We talk about empathy a lot in counseling. And so we really need this empathic connection with each other that has to do with coming out of our own experiences and experiencing one another. And I think a lot of us, me included sometimes as a counselor, think about, well, if I dive into this experience of suffering with another person, I'm going to get lost. Like, I don't know if I can come back from it. And I think that's the point. That's the point, that we move and dive into those places. And actually, the place where I can get lost in the suffering of another person connects me to the human experience. And it connects me to that person. And traversing that together, the pathway through that, again, I believe it always comes back to the shepherd of our hearts. We're being moved into a place where God is shepherding us into those places. So here I'm trying to connect a little bit between Christ, diverse cultural context, and the cultivation of clinical skills, right? We do have this place where empathy as a clinical skill, it is a clinical skill. Empathy is a clinical skill that we can engage in diverse cultural context, but without the personhood of Christ moving us through the experiences of humankind, I think we can get lost. So Dr. Cox talked a little bit about the unfamiliar terrains and the familiar terrains. And again, what I'm saying is that the familiar terrain of counseling is actually that it's very unfamiliar every time. We always are traversing into a person's experience, and it should be unfamiliar to us on some ends. On others, there's a place where all of our training as counselors, the critical thinking, the literature that we read, all of that points to a place where we can make some conjectures about what may be going on. Now, I know Dr. Cox has been teaching human growth and development. If you're in that class, you might have been learning about Bronfenbrenner's ecological model. We're not going to go specifically into that, but there's a model there that talks about relationships inside of systems and how systems will impact each other. Now, just that is fascinating to think about. And it can help us to understand what a person is going through. So again, there's this connection between knowledge and application that's really important. But one of the things I'm highlighting and engaging in diverse cultural contexts is really centrally our humility as counselors. And so moving through this time, I think that as we are able to engage in the common experience of others. Right. So essentially the question here, and this is the next slide here, Dr. Koch, if you can move into that, is to ask, where are we? And we're charting the course ahead, right? And if you have been percolating with questions, feel free to put those. I think Nathan's taking those questions. We want to take questions here in the next 10 minutes. Maybe there are more questions than answers. A lot of times when I talk, that's with what I hear happens. There are more questions than answers. But I want to leave you with this verse before we move into this question and answer in the last 10 minutes. And this is in Revelations 3:9. It says, "After these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude which no one can count, from every nation and all the tribes, peoples, and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, and palm branches were in their hands." So this is the end goal. This is the telos. This is where we see all nations, tribes, a community, right, of individuals and peoples of all different ethnicities, tribes, nations, and languages that are together beholding the Lamb of God. And so this is really kind of, again, going back into what we're building and how we're building community. I think a community is really built through common language. And so the primary thing that I'm sharing with you in the start of our webinars here and our community times is to say, let's go back to the basics in some ways of the centrality of Christ, and then scaffold our learning and add on to it all of what we know, the clinical training, the academic excellence, the study, the many literature articles that are out there. And so that's my exhortation there. And there is that need for preparation, the training and preparation, which is why we're here. If you're students, we're here to help you along. If you're students and also if you're faculty with us or part of the Huntington community, again, by proxy, you're part of our vision and mission statement. This both place of being shepherds in the field and also moving counselors into a place where they can become Christ-centered, they can engage in diverse cultural contexts, and they can have clinical excellence. So if you have questions, we can take a couple here. We'll just pause a little bit. If there's no other questions, we might chat a little bit here between Dr. Koch and myself. But if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box, and we'll wait a minute here. Any last comments from you, Dr. Koch? Anything that, oh, we have a question here. Yeah, you know, I've done that just recently. Yeah, so actually this past November, this would be, I think, my first month just doing everything virtually. So I've seen that for myself, Dr. Koch. I don't know if you've seen that with your colleagues in the field.
I have, and I think it's a very individual decision. There's certainly the financial component to whether or not that makes sense. But I have seen quite a few colleagues who are just going over to virtual offices. And I think that's partially driven by the conversations that they've had with their clientele over time, and clientele just remaining more comfortable with telehealth because they can do it from their homes. They don't have to commute. it fits better with their family life and balancing that. And so it is a very individual decision. And I think too, I'm about 50% virtual and about 50% in person to this point. I don't see that changing much, but because of a modality that I use for trauma work, and that being one of my specializations, for client care, it just makes sense for me to be in a office on a limited time basis. That and the human side of me desires that presence, that connection. And I know that that's true in conversations with some of my clients, that they have as well. And so it's been an interesting change in the way that we, utilize our clinical skills and our presence online. So I did have one client that I had never met in person. We started just virtual. And when she met me in the reception room, she said, "You're a lot taller than I thought that you were." And that was just an ear marker to me about just the differences between being present with one person virtually versus the office. So, and it's true, I'm taller than what most people think. So that's a great question. Yeah, and they held the office for a year in New York City without any use. So I think the indicators are our clients they're telling us something. And even our supervisees are telling us something similar as well, that they can still receive good supervision in an online environment. So I just hope that we're attending well and we're having these conversations with our clients.
Yeah, and that's a good point there, Dr. Cock, with trauma. I mean, there are contraindications towards telehealth, and I think more and more we need more training on that with telehealth, and what may actually be, on one level, it can be a contraindication, and then on some other pieces of literature, there's efficacy with forming a therapeutic alliance over telehealth. And so I think we need to have a balance of what we're learning experientially, but also what the literature is saying. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you've read of actual increased engagement with clients in virtual settings. Yeah, so that's more and more, I think, as the literature unfolds, we need to be studying those phenomena and looking at that in a critical way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other last questions? And there's a few minutes here, and it's hard to just pop in a question when you think there's a little bit of time left. But any last questions here? One of the main things I want to say is, we are here as people, resources, but also people. So if you want to connect with us, I can pop my information in, but you can easily find it on the Huntington website as well. And again, what we're going to do in our next webinar is, or the one after, whichever way we prepare, if we can get prepared for a following Zoom call, we want to engage with you personally as well. So we're planning on having sort of like a breakout session afterwards in our next time. This is kind of an introductory, and part of it is for us to get acquainted with the technology ourselves. And as Dr. Cock has mentioned, this is kind of a parallel process, I think, for all of us. And so, again, I want to invite you into the journey that we're all taking part of as counseling faculty. And we're moving forward in this building the kingdom of God together in the field of counseling. So appreciate you joining us, or if you're watching later on, appreciate you watching, and to again have that invitation to come in and to take part in what we're moving forward with as well.
Yeah, very much. I appreciate you all taking the time to join us today and to listen thoughtfully to what we had to share. I did put Dr. Lee and myself email addresses in there. I still have not memorized my work phone number. Otherwise, I would add it in there. And I don't have Dr. Lee's memorized either. that's the curse and blessing of a cell phone directory, but we are happy to chat or talk over anything that you had reactions to today or wanted to just converse about. We're always happy to do that.
So, blessings on your way. We'll be around in virtual space, but also in reality.
Thank you all.